Ever found yourself asking, what exactly is inflation and how does it affect me? Well, let's dive right in. Inflation, in its simplest form, is the increase in prices over time. Imagine your favorite bag of chips. Today it might cost you $1, but next year, due to inflation, you might have to shell out $1.10 for the same bag. This increase in price affects the purchasing power of your money. Let's stick with our bag of chips example. If you have $1 today, you can buy that bag of chips. But if prices increase and you still only have $1 next year, you won't be able to afford it. That's inflation at work, subtly eroding the value of your money over time. So, in a nutshell, inflation means things get more expensive and your money doesn't go as far as it used to. Now that we know what inflation is, it's essential to understand what causes it. You see, inflation isn't just a random occurrence. It's triggered by specific economic conditions, and there are two main culprits we need to talk about: demand pull and cost push inflation. Let's start with demand pull inflation. Imagine you're at an auction and there's a particular item that everyone wants. The more people that want it, the higher the bidding goes, right? Well, the same thing happens in an economy. When the demand for goods and services exceeds the supply, prices tend to rise. That's demand pull inflation in a nutshell. Too much money chasing too few goods. On the other hand, we have cost push inflation. This is a bit like being a baker whose price for flour just went up. To maintain your profit margins, you might have to increase the price of your bread. In the grand economic scale, when the costs of raw materials, wages, or other production costs increase, producers often pass these costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And voila, that's cost push inflation. Now, these two causes don't operate in isolation. They often interact in complex ways. For instance, a surge in demand might lead to increased production, which could then push up costs. Or a rise in costs might dampen demand, which could then pull prices down. It's a bit like a dance, with demand and costs twirling around each other, influencing the rhythm of the economy. One last thing to note is that inflation isn't always a bad thing. A little inflation is often seen as a sign of a healthy, growing economy. It's when inflation gets too high or happens too quickly that it can cause problems. So whether it's too much demand or increased costs, both scenarios lead to higher prices, which is inflation. We've understood what inflation is and what causes it, but how does it impact you and me? Let's break it down. At its core, inflation erodes our purchasing power. Picture this. If last year $100 could buy you a full cart of groceries, this year, due to inflation, that same 100 might only get you half a cart. That's the power of inflation. Or should I say the weakness of our purchasing power. Inflation doesn't just stop at our shopping cart, it permeates into our everyday life, increasing the cost of living. Rent, utilities, transportation, healthcare, even that delicious cup of coffee you enjoy every morning, all these become more expensive. And while we're at it, let's not forget about savings. Inflation can eat into those too, diminishing the value of money stashed away for a rainy day. But inflation doesn't just affect us on an individual level. It creates ripples across the entire economy. When prices rise, businesses may have to pay more for raw materials and labor. This could lead to them passing on these costs to consumers or even laying off employees. Additionally, inflation can create uncertainty. If prices are constantly changing, it becomes difficult for businesses to plan for the future and for consumers to make informed decisions. Now you might be thinking, but doesn't inflation also mean that wages increase? Well, yes, but often wages don't keep up with inflation. This means that even though you might be earning more on paper, in reality, your purchasing power could be decreasing. Inflation also has a psychological impact. When people expect prices to rise, they might start to spend more now to avoid paying more later. This can further fuel inflation, creating a vicious cycle. So, inflation can make life more expensive and uncertain, which is why it's important to understand it. By understanding inflation, we can make informed decisions and plan for the future. And that, my friends, is the power of financial literacy. Inflation might seem daunting, but there are ways to handle it. When it comes to mitigating the effects of inflation, you have several options at your disposal. One of the most effective strategies is to invest in assets that tend to increase in value over time. Real estate, for instance, is often considered a hedge against inflation. As the cost of living increases, so does the value of properties, helping you maintain your financial standing. Similarly, stocks can also be a solid choice. Companies generally raise their prices in response to inflation, which can lead to increased profits and, subsequently, higher stock prices. A well-diversified portfolio of stocks can provide a level of protection against the eroding effects of inflation. Another way to handle inflation is by increasing your income. This could mean asking for a raise, seeking a higher-paying job, or even starting a side hustle. The key here is to boost your earnings at a rate that outpaces inflation, helping you maintain or ideally increase your purchasing power. It's also important to factor inflation into your savings strategy. Traditional savings accounts may not offer interest rates that keep up with inflation. Therefore, considering other savings options such as high-yield savings accounts or certificates of deposit can be beneficial. Now, it's worth noting that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to inflation. The best strategy for you will depend on your personal circumstances, including your income, expenses, and long-term financial goals. Therefore, it's always a good idea to seek professional financial advice if you're unsure about how to protect your finances against inflation. Remember, inflation is part and parcel of any economy. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean you need to be proactive in managing your finances. By investing wisely, increasing your income, and choosing the right savings options, you can help mitigate its effects. Inflation is a fact of economic life, but with knowledge and planning, you can navigate it successfully. We've covered a lot of ground today on the topic of inflation. We've explored its causes, impacts, and ways to mitigate its effects. Knowledge is power, and understanding how inflation works equips you with the tools to manage your finances effectively. So let's keep the conversation going. Remember, understanding financial concepts like inflation gives you an advantage, especially during times of crisis. So make it a point to continue learning about finance. Don't forget to follow and subscribe for more empowering financial content. Stay informed, stay ahead.